Hello and welcome to this lesson on OCI Identity and Access Management Service. We also call it as OCI IAM. In this lesson, we will look at the core constructs of this particular service, including authentication, authorization, and also we will look at the IAM components like identity domains, compartments, users, groups, policies, and many more. So let's get started. So what is OCI IAM? It is a cloud-native service that provides identity and access management features. And if you look at it, it has two major components, identity and access management. The first part is identity, which ensures the authentication. It can be inbound, outbound, or SSO. So basically, it provides complete identity lifecycle management. It can also integrate with the existing identity stores, external identity providers, and applications to provide secure and easy access for end user. And the second part, access management of OCI IAM, offers fine-grained access control, or we also call it as role-based access control, where we define granular permissions using policies, like what actions users, groups, or services can perform on OCI resources. In simple terms, it lets you control who has access to what cloud resources, where the first part is about identities and the second part is about access management using policies that act as a control mechanism. When a user tries to perform an action on resources, OCI IAM checks the associated policies to see if the user is allowed to perform actions or not. So moving ahead, we will understand authentication and authorization in connection with OCI IAM. Authentication, also sometimes called as Auth-N. It is a security mechanism that ensures only authenticated users or entities are granted access to cloud resources. We deal with this process on daily basis. Like when you go to a particular website and it will ask you to enter the username and password to access some content, you are being first authenticated to ensure you are a valid user and allowed to access the content or not. In the same way, OCI IAM provides various methods of authentication of identity, like providing valid credentials to prove the identity of the entity requesting access, along with the user credentials like username, password, or passwordless authentication. Another common method is API keys. So when you are making API calls, whether you are using SDK or CLI, you can use the API keys, which is basically public-private key pair, to sign and authenticate these API calls. Also, the tokens obtained via OAuth 2.0 can be used for authentication and authorization, allowing applications to access resources on users' behalf. Next, with the instance principle, compute instance can securely access OCI resources without the need of having credentials like username and password. And with federated identity, we allow the users to authenticate using external identity providers that supports the SAML 2.0 protocol. And multi-factor authentication can be added on top, providing extra layer of security. All these mechanisms can be used for authentication and decide who as an identity is allowed to access OCI resources. After authentication, we have authorization. In OCI IAM, the authorization is done using IAM policies, where it ensures that only authorized entities can access and manipulate resources based on predefined policies and permissions. For example, let's say we have OCI tenancy with the resources such as compute instance, object storage, and database. Our first process will be user authentication, where identities will be confirmed, and once the identities are confirmed, the system will set user permissions and policies to determine what actions they can perform. For example, user A have permissions to start, stop, and terminate compute instance. User B have permission only to read storage bucket, and user C have full permission to manage or modify database. Now suppose user A tries to stop a compute instance, the authorization process will check if they have the required permissions or not. And if they do, the action is authorized and the command is executed. And now if user B tries to delete the storage bucket, the authorization process will deny the action because user do not have the necessary permissions. So now you must have got it. In OCI IAM, we use policies that define the permissions granted to users, groups, or other entities. And these policies are defined using a simple syntax that we will see in the subsequent lessons. Now in the case of OCI IAM, there are several components. And while we are covering the whole module, we will be dealing with each of them in separate lessons, like users, groups, identity domains, principals, dynamic groups, compartments, etc. etc. For now, let us look at few of them at very high level. Starting with identity domain. They are basically container for your users, groups and application. So let's say you have a set of users for production team and set of users for development team. Now you can separate them using logical container known as identity domain. And then we have this concept of compartments. That is also basically a logical container to isolate and secure your resources in OCI tenancy. And then we will take users, groups and policies and see how they work in practice in a use case of role-based access control. Well, what we do first is we create an identity domain. Then we create users and groups within that identity domain. And then we write policies to provide permissions to those groups. And policies are scoped down to tenancy or compartment. And of course, all our resources are available within compartment, where policy defines what permissions are set for resources in a compartment or tenancy. So this is how the whole service works, where identity domains help you to manage authentication and complete identity lifecycle management. And with the policy, you can define authorization, where you can provide granular or role-based access control. So to summarize, we got to know about OCI IAM core concepts using authentication and authorization. In authentication, we confirm who is allowed to access cloud resources, and we do authorization using policies to control access to the cloud resources. We also looked at various OCI components, and we will be dealing with each of them in following lessons. Thanks for your time and happy learning. Welcome to this lesson on OCI